The emerald silk of the dress felt like a lie against her skin. It was a bold color, a hopeful color, chosen by a sister who believed in things like serendipity and blind dates. Eleanor Vance believed in spreadsheets, deadlines, and the quiet, thudding certainty of her boss's footsteps in the hall. She smoothed the fabric over her hip, the motion doing nothing to soothe the frantic energy coiling in her stomach. The restaurant was a hushed cathedral of clinking silver and murmured conversations. A place so far removed from her daily life it felt like a movie set. Her sister, Maria, had been relentless. "He's perfect for you, Ellie. A friend of a friend, successful, tired of the usual scene. Just go. What's the worst that can happen?" The worst that could happen, she thought, was that he would be boring. Or rude. Or look at her. Really look at her body in this green dress, and let a flicker of disappointment cross his face before schooling it into polite neutrality. She had braced herself for that. She had a list of neutral topics ready, a polite exit strategy planned. She was competent. She was prepared. She had survived far worse than an awkward dinner. But then the maitre d' led a man toward her table, and the air in Eleanor's lungs turned to glass. It was not the suit, a cut of midnight wool so perfect it seemed molded to his frame. It was not the severe, handsome line of his jaw or the dark, unreadable eyes that swept the room with an unnerving stillness. It was the weight of his presence, a gravitational pull that silenced the noise around him, that made heads turn and then quickly turn away. She knew that presence. She felt it 5 days a week through 2 inches of solid oak. He stopped at her table. The maitre d' melted away. For a moment, he did not seem to recognize her. He was seeing the dress, the softly lit room, the woman his friend had described. Then his eyes, the color of scorched earth, met hers fully, and the world stopped. There was no visible reaction. No shock, no surprise. Just a subtle, terrifying shift. The polite stranger vanished, and in his place stood her employer, Mr. Costello. Marco Costello. The man whose quiet orders could make titans of industry tremble. The man whose name was whispered in fear and reverence across the 5 boroughs. And she was his secretary, the woman who screened his calls and managed his calendar and knew exactly which of his rivals were scheduled for a permanent vacation. He looked at her, and in that single silent moment, she knew her prepared exit strategy was useless. She could not leave this table. She could not leave this room. Not until he decided she could. His gaze was a physical weight, pinning her to the velvet chair. The silence stretched, thin and sharp. He had not moved, had not spoken, but the air around them had grown cold, compressed. He was assessing her not as a potential date, but as a problem, an anomaly. Ms. Vance, his efficient, unobtrusive secretary, sitting here in a silk dress under a name she had never used in his office. Eleanor. He knew her only as the signature on his memos, the disembodied voice on his intercom. Now she was a body, a face, a complication he had not anticipated. "Ms. Vance," he said finally. His voice was the same as it was in the office. Low, quiet, and absolute. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, and it stripped away the entire illusion of the evening. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Mr. Costello." He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat. The movement was economical, precise. He did not ask. He simply occupied the space. He placed his hands on the table, palms down. They were clean, powerful hands, with a heavy gold signet ring on his right pinky finger. She had seen that ring flash in the light of her desk lamp 1,000 times as he signed documents. Documents that detailed shipping manifests for goods that never seemed to arrive at any legitimate port. Documents that transferred ownership of properties from men who subsequently disappeared from the city. "My associate, Mr. Vescovi, has a sister," Marco stated, his eyes never leaving hers. "He is enthusiastic and prone to poor judgment." So that was the connection. Vescovi, a new capo eager to please. Eleanor's sister, Maria, worked as a dental hygienist in a practice Vescovi's wife frequented. A chain of well-meaning, catastrophic introductions. "My sister meant well," Eleanor managed. her voice steadier than she felt. I'm sure she did. The words were flat, devoid of any actual assurance. He signaled the waiter without looking, a barely perceptible lift of his chin. The man appeared instantly, his professional smile strained. Bring us the Barolo, the 98-inch. The waiter nodded and fled. Eleanor knew that wine cost more than her monthly rent. It was the bottle he ordered for sit-downs, for meetings where the stakes were life and death. Her heart began a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. This was no longer a date. This was a meeting, and she had no idea what was on the agenda. She should leave. She should stand up, offer a polite excuse, and walk out of the restaurant and never look back. But her legs felt disconnected from her brain, and the look in his eyes told her that walking away was not an option that was currently on the table. He had not told her to stay. He did not need to. His stillness was a command. So, he began, leaning forward just enough to make the space between them feel intimate and threatening. Tell me, Ms. Vance, what exactly did your sister tell you about me? The question was a test, a trap. She knew the official story he presented to the world. A logistics and import-export magnate, a shrewd investor, a pillar of the Italian-American business community. She also knew the truth because the truth was what she typed up in coded memos and filed in encrypted drives. The truth was violence, territory, and tribute. The truth was that the man sitting across from her was the head of the Costello family, one of the most powerful criminal organizations on the East Coast. She said you were in logistics, Eleanor answered carefully, choosing the corporate lie, and that you were a private man. A flicker of something, not amusement but perhaps approval, crossed his features. And you? What did Mr. Vescovi tell his wife about you? That my name is Eleanor, that I work in administration, that I am available. The last word came out tasting like ash. Available, he repeated softly, letting the word hang in the air. He looked at her then, a long, deliberate appraisal that was far more invasive than any disappointed glance she had braced for. He took in the green dress, the way she held her hands clasped in her lap, the nervous pulse beating at the base of her throat. She felt exposed, analyzed, every mundane detail of her life being sorted into columns on a ledger only he could read. Asset, liability. He was deciding which she was. And Eleanor had a sickening feeling that, in his world, there was no third option. The wine arrived, poured with a reverent silence. Marco tasted it, gave a curt nod, and dismissed the sommelier. He filled her glass, then his own. The silence returned, heavier this time, steeped in the scent of dark cherries and old secrets. Eleanor stared at the deep red liquid, her mind racing. This was a nightmare. She worked for him. She knew things. Not everything, but enough. She knew the names. She knew the places. She had built a wall in her mind between the polite, efficient Miss Vance of the office and the woman who went home at night and tried to forget the quiet menace that paid her bills. Now that wall was gone. He was here in her world, and he had brought all of his with him. Just as she was about to risk speaking, to try and salvage some semblance of normalcy, a shadow fell over their table. Marco, I didn't expect to see you here. The voice was smooth, laced with a false congeniality that made the hairs on Eleanor's arms stand up. She knew that voice. She had heard it on phone recordings she was never meant to have transcribed. Luca Gallo, head of the Gallo family, Marco Costello's most bitter and ambitious rival. Eleanor did not dare to look up. She kept her eyes fixed on her wine glass, her entire body rigid. Marco's demeanor, already cold, became glacial. The temperature around the table dropped 10 degrees. Gallo, Marco said. His voice was perfectly level, but the single word was a razor blade. Enjoying a quiet night out? Gallo's eyes slid to Eleanor, a slick, oily appraisal. You are a man of surprising tastes. I did not realize you had an appetite for comfort. The insult was clear, aimed at her size, but it was a probe, a test of Marco's reaction. Eleanor's cheeks burned with a hot, furious shame. She wanted to disappear. Marco did not react. He simply watched Gallo, his expression unreadable. My tastes are my own business. Of course, Gallo smiled, a predatory flash of white teeth. A man like you must have a safe place to rest his head, a soft place to land. Be sure to protect your assets. The market is so volatile these days. He lingered for a moment longer, enjoying the suffocating tension he had created, then moved on with a lazy wave. The moment he was gone, Eleanor felt like she could breathe again, but the air was poisoned. It was too late. She had been seen. She had been marked. Gallo had not seen a secretary on an awkward blind date. He had seen Marco Costello's woman. A weakness. Target. Marco picked up his wine glass, his movements still infuriatingly calm. But his eyes, when they met hers again, were like chips of obsidian. The dinner, he said, his voice a low command, is over. He rose from the table, dropping several $100 bills without a glance. He did not wait for her. He simply started walking toward the exit, expecting her to follow. For a half-second, Eleanor considered staying put, just sitting there and letting him walk away. But the image of Luca Gallo's predatory smile was burned into her mind. She was in danger, a danger she couldn't even comprehend, and the only person in the world who could navigate it was the man who had just walked away from the table. Her boss, her date, her doom. With a deep, shaky breath, she picked up her clutch and followed him into the night. The valet brought his car around instantly, a black, armored sedan that looked more like a military vehicle than a luxury car. It was sleek, silent, and utterly anonymous. A man in a dark suit held the back door open for her. Marco was already in the other side, a silhouette against the city lights. She slid in, the door closing behind her with a heavy, final thud that sealed her inside. The car pulled away from the curb with an impossible smoothness, gliding into the river of New York traffic. She sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly on her lap, the expensive leather of the seat cold against her bare arms. She did not know where they were going. She did not dare to ask. The partition between them and the driver was up, encasing them in a bubble of tense, suffocating silence. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, a mix of sandalwood and something else, something sharp and metallic like cold steel. It was the smell of his office, the smell of power. You understand the position you are in, he said, not looking at her. He was staring out the window, at the blur of lights and people passing by. I was seen with you, she said, her voice small. You were not just seen with me, he corrected, his tone cutting. You were seen by Luca Gallo. He does not believe in coincidence. He will assume you are significant. But I'm not. I'm your secretary. He finally turned his head, and his gaze pinned her. He does not know that. He will not care. To him, you are leverage. You are a message he can send me. And Gallo's messages are always written in blood. A cold dread washed over her, so profound it made her feel weightless. This was real. The coded memos, the hushed phone calls, the men who came to the office with haunted eyes and left with their shoulders slumped in defeat. It was all real, and she had just stepped from behind the curtain onto the main stage. What are you going to do? She whispered. I am going to fix Vescovi's mistake, he said. And I am going to ensure my assets are protected. She looked out the window trying to get her bearings. They were heading downtown, toward the financial district, but they had passed the turnoff for her small apartment in a safe, boring neighborhood miles away. This isn't the way to my apartment. No, he said, turning his attention back to the city. It is not. The car descended into a private underground garage, the steel gate rolling shut behind them with an echoing clang. They were beneath a skyscraper, a modern glass and steel monolith that scraped the sky. This was his building, the headquarters of his legitimate empire, and the fortress from which he ran his real one. He got out of the car and came around to her side, opening the door himself. It was not a gesture of courtesy. It was an order. Get out. She followed him to a private elevator, the ride up so fast and smooth her ears popped. The doors opened directly into a sprawling penthouse apartment. It was nothing like she had imagined. She had expected ornate, old-world furniture, heavy draperies, maybe even some gaudy art. Instead, the space was brutally minimalist. White walls, polished concrete floors, vast expanses of glass that offered a breathtaking, godlike view of the entire city. The furniture was sparse, modern, and looked profoundly uncomfortable. It was not a home. It was a watchtower. "You will stay here," he said, walking toward the massive window, his back to her. "My men will retrieve your necessities from your apartment. You will not contact your sister. You will not contact anyone. Your phone," he held out his hand without looking. Slowly, she retrieved her phone from her clutch and placed it in his outstretched palm. His fingers closed around it. He did not look at it. He simply put it in his pocket. He had just severed her from her entire life with one simple gesture. "For how long?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "For as long as it takes for Luca Gallo to understand that you are not a weapon he can use against me." She looked around the vast, empty space. It was beautiful in a cold, sterile way, but it felt like a cage. A very expensive, well-appointed cage. On a long marble console against one wall, there was a single framed photograph turned face down. An odd detail in a room so deliberately curated. It was the only personal item she could see. "You put me in danger," she said, a spark of anger cutting through her fear, "by insisting I stay for that dinner." He turned from the window, his face unreadable in the dim light. "The danger was there the moment you sat at my table. My staying was a calculation. Leaving immediately would have signaled to Gallo that you were important enough to hide. Staying signaled that I had nothing to fear from him seeing us. Every choice has a consequence, Ms. Vance. You should have learned that by now, working for me." He was right. She had seen it 100 times. The cold, brutal calculus he applied to every situation. And now she was part of the equation. She walked further into the room, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. Her eyes were drawn again to the face-down photograph. An impulse she couldn't control made her reach out and turn it over. It was a picture of two young men, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning in the summer sun. One was a younger Marco, his face less severe, a ghost of a smile on his lips. The other was someone she didn't recognize, handsome and laughing. Behind them stood an older man with Marco's eyes, his expression proud. His father, she realized, the late Don Costello. "Do not touch what is not yours." His voice was quiet, but it cracked like a whip in the silent room. She snatched her hand back as if burned. He was beside her in an instant, his presence overwhelming. He picked up the photograph, his thumb gently brushing over the face of the man who was not him. For a fleeting second, an expression of profound, aching loss crossed his face. It was so raw, so unguarded. It stole her breath. Then the mask slammed back down. "He was my father's most trusted soldier," Marco said, his voice flat and hard. "I brought him into the family. I vouched for him. He was like a brother to me." He paused, his jaw tight. "He betrayed us to the gallows. It cost my father his life." He set the photograph face down again, the motion precise and final. He had not just shared a piece of his past. He had given her a warning. "This is what happens to people I trust. This is the price of betrayal." And he had brought her here, into the heart of his fortress. A woman he barely knew. A woman who knew far too much about his business. She understood then that her safety was not his primary concern. His primary concern was control. And she was a variable he had not yet solved. A chime sounded from the elevator, and a moment later it opened to admit a thick-set man in a dark suit. Rico, his underboss. He nodded once at Marco, his eyes flicking to Eleanor for a half-second with cold curiosity before dismissing her entirely. "Boss," Rico said, his voice a low gravel. "We have a problem at the docks. The Gallo shipment." "Luca does not waste time," Marco murmured, his attention already shifting. He walked with Rico toward the far side of the room, their voices dropping to hushed, urgent tones. Eleanor stayed where she was, feeling like a ghost in the room. She was not part of this conversation, but she was the reason it was happening. Gallo was making a move, testing him, all because of a dinner she never should have attended. She could only catch snippets of their conversation. Words like container, police. Informant Rico was agitated, speaking quickly. Marco was calm, his posture relaxed, but she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. She knew the shipment they were talking about. She had processed the paperwork. It was a consignment of Italian olive oil, except the bill of lading was impossibly heavy, the insurance valued at a preposterous figure. Gallo must have tipped them off, Rico was saying. The feds are all over Pier 12. If they open that container, we're finished. They won't open it yet, Marco said. They'll wait. They want to see who comes to claim it. What's the play? We can't just leave it there. Eleanor watched them, her mind working, connecting details from a dozen different files she had organized. Gallo, Pier 12, the informant. She remembered a memo from a few weeks ago. A new customs agent assigned to that pier, one with a known gambling problem. A Gallo associate had been seen paying his debts. It was a small detail, one Marco might have overlooked in the grand scheme of things. She took a breath and did the stupidest, most reckless thing she had ever done in her life. She walked toward them. Rico stopped talking and glared at her as she approached. Boss! Marco turned, one eyebrow raised in a silent, dangerous question. The customs agent at Pier 12, Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady. His name is Wallace. He has a significant gambling debt. A Gallo capo paid it off last month. The payment was routed through a shell corporation, the same one Gallo uses for his construction contracts. She knew this because she had been tasked with tracking the financial movements of their rivals. It was tedious work, but she was meticulous. Rico stared at her, then at Marco, his mouth slightly open. Marco's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened, focusing on her with a new intensity. He was looking at her not as a secretary, not as a liability, but as an unexpected source of intelligence. She's right, he said to Rico, a note of finality in his voice. It's not an anonymous tip. It's Wallace. He's Gallo's man on the inside. Change the plan. We don't go near the pier. We go for Wallace. We make him move the container for us. Rico nodded, a look of grudging respect on his face as he glanced at Eleanor again. He left as quickly as he came, the elevator doors sliding shut behind him. They were alone again. The city lights glittered outside the vast windows. You have a good memory, Miss Vance, Marco said. It was not a compliment. It was an observation, a reevaluation of her potential threat and her potential worth. It's my job to remember details, Mr. Costello, she replied, holding his gaze. For the first time, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. It did not reach his eyes. Indeed it is, he said. Perhaps Vescovi's judgment is not so poor after all. That small, almost imperceptible shift was more terrifying than his anger. He was beginning to see a use for her. And in his world, to be useful was to be indispensable. To be indispensable was to be owned. The next few days passed in a surreal, suspended reality. She lived in his silent penthouse, a gilded prison with a billion-dollar view. His men, polite and menacing, brought her clothes from her apartment, books, her laptop. They brought her food from the city's best restaurants, which she ate alone at a vast dining table, feeling the weight of Marco's absence more than she ever felt his presence. He came and go at odd hours, a phantom in his own home. He rarely spoke to her, but she felt his eyes on her when he was there. He would watch her as she sat reading, or as she worked on her laptop, organizing her own life into neat, pointless folders. It was an unnerving, constant scrutiny. She learned the rhythms of his life, the quiet, intense phone calls in Italian that always ended abruptly, the late-night meetings with men whose faces were hard and whose suits were expensive. She learned that he slept very little, and that he drank his coffee black and scalding. She was a silent witness, a piece of furniture in his life, and the longer she stayed, the more the lines blurred between Eleanor Vance, the competent administrator, and the woman who now knew the inner workings of a criminal enterprise. One afternoon, desperate for a breath of real air, for a connection to her old life, she decided she needed something from her apartment. A specific folder of personal documents she had forgotten. It was a flimsy excuse, but she was starting to feel the walls of the penthouse closing in. She told the guard stationed by the elevator, a man named Leo. He was reluctant, but he made a call. The order came back from Marco himself. She could go, but two of his men, Leo and another named Stefano, would go with her. No arguments. The trip to her quiet, tree-lined street in Queens felt like visiting a foreign country. Her building, with its slightly worn carpets and the lingering smell of her neighbor's cooking, felt like a relic from another lifetime. Leo waited in the car while Stefano stood like a statue outside her apartment door. The moment she stepped inside, the normalcy of it all was a physical blow. Her half-read book on the nightstand, her favorite mug in the dish drainer, a life interrupted. She found the folder she was looking for, but she lingered, touching the spine of a book, straightening a picture on the wall. She was delaying the inevitable return to the cage. That was her mistake. A sudden, splintering crash came from the living room. Stefano shouted her name, a strangled cry cut short. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. Her mind, trained by weeks of proximity to Marco Costello, went into survival mode. She backed away from the living room, toward her small bedroom window that led to a rickety fire escape. The bedroom door burst open. Two men she had never seen before filled the doorway. They were not Marco's men. They were rough, their movements sloppy and brutal. One had a cruel smile on his face. "Gallo sends his regards," he said, lunging for her. Instinct took over. She grabbed the heaviest thing on her dresser, a glass paperweight, and threw it at his head. It missed, shattering against the wall, but it made him flinch. It bought her a second. She scrambled for the window, but the other man grabbed her, his hand tangling painfully in her hair. She twisted, bringing her heavy leather purse, still slung over her shoulder, around in a wide arc. It was filled with a book, her keys, a wallet, all the dense, heavy detritus of a life. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening thud. He grunted, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. A blur of motion came from the hallway. Leo! He must have heard the crash. He moved with a speed and efficiency that was terrifying, a stark contrast to the sloppy thugs. The fight was short, brutal, and ended with the two intruders on the floor, groaning and incapacitated. Leo stood over them, breathing heavily, a thin line of blood trickling from his temple. And then, the apartment was filled with another presence. Marco. He must have been close by. He stood in the doorway, his eyes sweeping the scene. The broken glass, the two men on the floor, Leo bleeding, and her, standing by the window, her heart hammering against her ribs, her knuckles white where she gripped her purse. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. His gaze landed on her, and something in his eyes shifted. It was a look of pure, undiluted possession. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating thing she had ever seen. He walked toward her, his steps silent and predatory. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before his fingers gently touched a strand of her hair that had been pulled loose. He tucked it behind her ear, his touch surprisingly gentle. "He came after you," Marco said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Because he thinks you are mine." He paused, his dark eyes boring into hers, seeing past the fear, past the adrenaline, to the core of her. He was not wrong. It was not a declaration of love. It was a statement of ownership, a claim. In his world, they were the same thing. And in that moment, standing in the wreckage of her old life, Eleanor did not pull away. She did not protest. A line had been crossed, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she had no desire to go back. Later that night, back in the sterile silence of the penthouse, she sat at her laptop. Without being asked, without a word of discussion, she opened her remote connection to the office server. She found the folder containing the weekly surveillance summaries she prepared for him. She found the file on Luca Gallo, and with a steady hand, she dragged it to the secure digital shredder and deleted every trace of it from the system. It was a small act of treason against her old life, and an absolute act of loyalty to her new one. She had chosen a side. The final confrontation was not a choice. It was an inevitability. Gallo was bleeding, his operations disrupted by Marco's precise, surgical strikes, all guided by the quiet intelligence Eleanor had provided. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals were predictable. He would lash out at the perceived source of his pain. He would come for her. Marco's plan was to move her to a safe house in another state with a new name until Gallo was a memory. He laid it all out for her in the cold light of dawn, the city still asleep below them. It was a sensible plan, a safe plan. It was an exile. No, she said. He stopped, turning from the window to look at her. It is not a request. I'm not a package to be shipped, Mr. Costello, she said, her voice even. Gallo thinks I'm your weakness. Let's use that. Let's make him think he's right. A dangerous light entered his eyes. What are you proposing? I know something, she said. Gallo has a new bookkeeper, an old-timer named Sal. He's meticulous. He keeps a second private ledger of all Gallo's off-book transactions. He keeps it on a thumb drive he wears on a chain around his neck. He thinks no one knows. How do you know this? Because Sal's niece is my sister's patient, and Sal talks too much when he's on painkillers after a root canal. It was a sliver of information, a piece of gossip, but in their world, information was ammunition. Gallo is meeting Sal tonight, at his restaurant in the Bronx. He thinks it's his territory. He'll be comfortable. He'll be arrogant. Marco was silent for a long time, studying her. He was weighing the risk, the reward. He was looking at her, this woman who had been his secretary, who had stumbled into his life, and seeing not a liability, but a weapon. His weapon. You will be nowhere near that restaurant, he said finally. He won't bring the ledger if he doesn't think the threat is real, she argued. He needs to see me. He needs to believe he has you, that he can trade me for his own survival. The argument was short, and it was the first one she had ever won with him. The plan was a high-wire act. She would arrive at the restaurant alone, a lure. Marco's men would be everywhere, invisible. He would be watching, waiting for the moment Gallo revealed the ledger. It was insane. It was terrifying. And Eleanor felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. That evening, she wore a simple black dress. When she was ready, Marco was waiting for her by the elevator. He held out a small, cold piece of metal, panic button disguised as a pendant. If anything deviates from the plan, you press this, he said, his voice taut. His fingers brushed hers as he handed it to her, a spark of heat in the cold room. His eyes held hers. Eleanor. It was the first time he had used her given name. It sounded different in his mouth. Not a name but a prayer. Or a vow. The restaurant was exactly as she'd imagined. Loud, filled with Gallo's men pretending to be customers. Gallo himself was at a corner booth, looking smug. The moment he saw her, his smile was triumphant. The first part of the plan had worked. She was the bait and the trap was closing. The dinner was a charade of threats and false promises. She played her part, pretending to be terrified, pleading for him to let her go. All the while, her eyes scanned the room, looking for the telltale signs of Marco's men. She saw nothing. She was truly alone. Finally, Sal arrived. A nervous, older man who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Gallo dismissed her, telling her to wait in his office. This was it, the moment of the exchange. As she walked away, she saw Sal reach for the chain around his neck. But as she reached the office door, one of Gallo's men blocked her path. Change of plans, he snarled, grabbing her arm. The boss wants to make sure your boyfriend is motivated. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her calm. This was the deviation. She fumbled for the pendant, her thumb pressing the button hard. The world exploded into controlled chaos. It was not a firefight. It was a symphony of violence. Marco's men materialized from the shadows, moving with a silent, deadly grace. The fight was over in seconds. Marco himself appeared before her, his face a mask of stone. He looked not at the men on the floor, but at Gallo, who was being held by two of his soldiers, Sal's thumb drive clutched in Rico's hand. Marco walked to Gallo, his movements deliberate. He said something too low for her to hear. Gallo's face went white with terror. Then Marco turned and walked back to her, taking her arm gently. "It's over," he said. They drove back to the penthouse in silence. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray. The city was waking up to a world that was different, a world where the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. In the vast, empty living room, he finally spoke. "I can give you a new life," he said, his back to her as he stared out at the dawn. "Anywhere you want to go. A new name. Enough money to never have to work again. You will be safe. You will be free." It was the out she should have craved. A return to normalcy. A life without fear, without the scent of gunpowder and the weight of secrets. She could go back to being the woman who believed in spreadsheets and deadlines. She walked to stand beside him, their shoulders almost touching. She looked out at the same view. The city, his city, spread out before them. It was no longer just a landscape. It was a battlefield she had survived, a kingdom she had helped secure. "And what if I don't want to be free?" she asked softly. "What if this is where I want to be?" He turned to look at her, and for the first time, the smile that touched his lips reached his eyes. It was not a happy smile. It was a smile of recognition, of acceptance, of two broken, dangerous pieces finding a perfect, terrifying fit. He did not say anything. He simply held out his hand. Eleanor looked at his hand, the one with the signet ring that had signed orders of death and fortune. She looked at his face, at the man who was her boss, her captor, her protector, and she made her choice. She placed her hand in his. It was not a surrender. It was a coronation.